Hello everyone, my name is Amit Singh and welcome to the Cisco collaboration group. I thank everyone for joining this group and liking the content. Please do provide a feedback in case you think that there is a way that I could improve my content and I can then share some more good information with you guys. So let's discuss about today's content. So today's content is about AXL API interface that is being provided by Cisco. So let's see how you can use this interface to provision the devices using the third-party tools. Okay, so let's get started. So in our last video, we discussed about what is an AXL interface and how it is used by CUCM for provisioning, or how it is used by the third party tools for provisioning. But for example, let's say you have a CUCM here. Okay, so this is your CUCM, and then here you have your third-party application. So this is your third-party application, so provisioning application, and then CUCM wants to communicate and third-party wants to communicate. So they both want to communicate with each other. How this could happen? Probably, so this AXL API, how is it exposed to the third-party software? How does third-party software communicate, and how can they make use of these AXL APIs? So they make use of something called as a SOAP application. So they make use of a SOAP-based web services, and using this SOAP-based web services, they can communicate with CUCM and do the provisioning. So what is a SOAP? SOAP is basically a simple object access protocol, and it's also like you have SIP protocol for calling and every other thing, registrations and everything. You have something called as a SOAP protocol in the specification of the SOAP currently is 1.1. So using this protocol, you can do the provisioning in the CUCM. Along with the SOAP, to define the web services, there is something called as WSDL. So this is also a specification which is called as a web services um, description language. So WSDL, web services description language. So this is also used to provide the communication between the CUCM and third-party application. So basically, it's used to define the web services. So CUCM uses this WSDL file as well to define the web services, so that the external softwares can call these web services using the SOAP APIs. So what basically SOAP does is actually it provides an XML based communication between the two applications. So it encodes the XML data inside its format, and then it does the provisioning, or it provides an API interface. So not API interface, sorry. So but people can then make use of this provisioning services. So this is how the SOAP works. Okay, so I already talked about SOAP. I already talked about AXL. Let's talk about something called as XML. So what is XML? XML is nothing but an extensible markup language. And what does it contain? So basically, let's say this is a phone definition for in the form of XML code. So this is how you write an XML code between the tags. So what is a tag? So anything that you write inside these brackets is called as a tag. So this is a start tag and slash inside the bracket. This is an end tag inside the XML code or inside the XML script, you can say. Okay, so maybe the software developers would know about these things. So here you see that there is a tag called as a phone, and then inside this tag there are sub tags, you can say, called as names and descriptions and the phone numbers. And then there will be certain definitions, like for example, if there is a name tag, what has to be the format of this name? So can it be a string, or can it be an integer, or can it be a floating integer or something, then if it's a description, can it be an alphanumeric description or something? So there are some rules defined inside this tag. So this is how this XML codes is being defined. So basically format is, you have tagging of the uh, parameters that you need. So basically tags could be anything. But one thing to keep in mind is that whatever the tags you define, that should be known between the two applications. So like I told, if this is a CUCM, so this is your CUCM, and this is your provisioning application. So whenever a provisioning application will send a request to CUCM in the form of an XML page or XML request, using a SOAP interface or SOAP API. So CUCM should know, what is it? Do I support this? Do I support this tag or not? For example, do I support this phone tag, or I do not support a phone tag? So there has to be a mutual understanding between these two applications. And how can this mutual understanding be achieved is nothing but by defining something called as an XML schema definition. So basically what will happen is a CUCM will consist of something called as an XSD file or .xsd file, or XML schema definition file. And inside this XML schema definition, it will define all the objects, all the APIs that people can use. So basically it says, if you want to add a phone, there will be an XML schema definition for it. So, or if you want to create a partition, so for a partition, there would be an XML schema definition. Or if you want to create a calling search space. So for all the objects, for all the APIs, the CUCM will have an XML schema definition, right? So the first three things that you should be aware about is what is SOAP. The second thing is what is XML. So basically, uh, let me erase. Yeah, let me erase these things so that it comes clear, and then I can properly write it down here, and then you guys understand what I mean. So before starting to learn about provisioning or understanding about this provisioning, what you could do is please first understand these topics. So first is what is SOAP. So as I discussed now for a couple of while, so I hope you guys know what is SOAP now. And then what is XML, and then what is WSDL. So in short, what WSDL does is it will provide all the um, so it will not provide a mechanism, but it will say what are the possible things that you could do with this schema definitions or with the APIs. What are the possible requests that you could send? So maybe WSDL will say, okay, you can add a phone using the XML schema definition. You can, you know, modify a phone or something like this. So all this permissions will be defined inside the all these web services, not the permissions, but the web services will be defined. And then these provisioning applications can use this web services and then send the transaction to happen, you know. So basically, whenever you want to send a request, let's say this is your provisioning application here, and this is your Cisco Unified Communications Manager. So whenever you send a request, it's in a form of a SOAP request. We will see shortly how a SOAP request looks like, and how a XSD or XML schema definition looks like, and how where you can find it and how you can download it, all these things. Okay, so suppose this is a provisioning application which is sending an add phone request. Okay, so when the provisioning application sends a add request, that is something called as a SOAP transaction, right? So there is a SOAP transaction that happens, and it's an encoded XML request that is being sent. Okay, so how could you get then XML schema definition file? Basically, you can get it from Cisco Unified Communications Manager. In my second video, I will show you how you will be doing this practically. So let's say, just a moment. You can just search on uh, developer.cisco.com, and then you will get a schema reference, and then here are all these schema references, XML schema definitions, you know. So let's search for um, partition, for example, or CSS. So this one. So this is how an XML schema definition would look like, you know. So what is the element and what is the type of the element, this will all be defined in an XML schema definition. But looking at this, you will say, okay, oh, it looks too difficult. How can I um, define a SOAP request? Because if I want to send a request from my third-party application or provisioning application, so from here, I have to send the request to CUCM, and you are saying that I need to use a SOAP request, and then how could I interpret the XML schema? So don't worry, and that too using a WSDL, so don't worry, we have some SOAP UI clients who can interpret the WSDL files and then provide you an output saying, okay, these are the things that are possible, and these are the things, requests that you could send across to CUCM. So we will have a look at those things as well. Okay, so yeah, this is how the schema definition, let's say for CSS would look like. You see, it also suggests the type. So it says it's a string with, I think it's a 50 characters. I'm not sure about this. It's 50 characters, I think, but I will have a look at it. So this is how an XML schema definition would look like, So basically, what XML schema does is it describes the object. So in this case, for example, it describes a CSS. It describes CSS using an XML definition or XML format. This is the uh, part that XML schema plays for the provisioning, right? So this is an example that I was showing how you could define a CSS in the XML schema using an XML format. Okay, so as you saw now that how a schema definition looks like, let's now talk about how a SOAP message or a SOAP request looks like, So this is a SOAP message. There's just a broad 10,000 bit overview of how a SOAP message looks like. So it consists of something called a SOAP envelope. And then inside a SOAP envelope, there is something called as a SOAP header and then something called as SOAP body. So SOAP header is optional, and then there is a SOAP body where you will write some XML codes related to your requests. So for example, if you want to add a phone, or if you want to remove some object or read some object from CUCM database, so you could define those parameters inside this SOAP envelope. Now let's see how a SOAP envelope looks like. So this is how a SOAP envelope looks like. So it starts with something called as SOAP env. So this defines, okay, this is a SOAP envelope message or a SOAP message inside, and this is a SOAP envelope. And then it's using an XML code to define the messages or the parameters or the requests, And the first line is very important because at the end it defines the version of the API that you're using, or the WSDL file that you're using. So here we are using some CUCM version 12.5. So the first line of the SOAP env message is really very important to interpret the schema files that is on the CUCM, so that the CUCM can accordingly, interpret the request and then provide a proper response to the provisioning application. So you know if XML schema at the end, if it's describing the objects using the XML, so how do we know that what kind of request is possible with this schema? This is where as I told you before, a WSDL file that is provided by CUCM comes into picture, or web services description language comes into picture and says, okay, look, this is what you can do with this object. So if you have a CSS, and in the CSS, what are the things that are possible? You can interpret that using a WSDL file. So it's like a signature method for the web services. All right. So I think I have discussed everything about it, the basic things. So let me just summarize it in a minute. So basically, the things that you should know about is SOAP. Once again, what is a SOAP? Oh, sorry, I will take another color. Maybe it's a little bit dark. Yeah. So you should know about a SOAP API. So why is it used? So that it can interpret, or it can connect with the AXL interface on the CUCM and then submit a request or a transaction. You should know about what is an XML, what is WSDL, and then what is XML schema definition, I will say. So basically, this is a third party. This is your CUCM. This is your this is your CUCM. This is your provisioning application, and this is your interface. That's a SOAP API, and using the XML. Oops, sorry, XML. All right, and then what are the possible things that you can do is provided by WSDL. And how can you define an object? That object is already defined using an XML schema definition. And then what are the possible things that you could do is provided by WSDL. Okay, making use of these two things, you could provision the objects inside the CUCM database and make life easier for all the colleagues. All right, this was it. Thank you very much. Until my next video, wherein I will be showing you guys how to use the SOAP UI client interface and how to use Postman application to define or provision the objects or phones or directory numbers or Jabber, for example, inside the CUCM database. Until then, thank you very much for your time and take care. Bye bye.